Well, kia ora, now mai, haere mai. Welcome everybody to another Tourism New Zealand webinar. Well, when we first set this up, I think the title of it was By Crikey, Australia Marketing Update. Well, by crikey, things have changed quite dramatically in the last 12, 24 hours and more to come. So we've made a bit of a change to today's lineup. We're going to talk about still Australia, of course, most importantly, but certainly have some words on the current situation, maybe the new normal. So here's the program for today. Just move on to the next slide, which gives you a brief outline. Shortly, I'll introduce Stephen England-Hall, New Zealand Executive, to talk about exactly what's recently been announced and also a lead into what's happening in Australia. And of course, Andrew Waddell, our General Manager Australia, will then join us to get into a little bit more detail about the Australian market overview and the exciting things that will happen by crikey at some stage. Q&A, most importantly, we'll have about 30 minutes for that. You know how it works. Type those in down the bottom and we'll pose those questions to the panelists. Without further ado, Stephen, welcome. What a day.
Kia ora koutou and kia ora Paul, everyone. How are you all? Thank you for setting this up. I'm actually glad that we managed to keep it in the schedule today, given all the things that have been going on in the last, feels like 24 hours, but I think it's only about 12 or 15, in fact. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us today as well from Sydney. I look forward to hearing from you about what's going on over there too. And also, look, just thanks to all the attendees. It's great to have all of you on the call. As with these things, the Q&A is usually most interesting as opposed to what we have to say. So look, we will try and keep the content brief. Well, I'll certainly keep my piece brief. Andrew will run through where his thinking's at with regards to preparations around Australia, and then we will leave some time for Q&A to run through at the end, and hope to have a further discussion with all of you. I guess the main thing, I mean, none of this is going to be a surprise, so hopefully to any of you, but of course last night the government announced that there are 4 COVID-19 cases of community transmission in the Auckland region. Of course, this has resulted in Auckland going to level 3 and the rest of the country at level 2 for at least the next 3 days. You know, obviously this has continuous impacts on our industry, this whole COVID scenario does. And I guess the thought that springs to mind out of this is, you know, today's the first day of another series of decisions and another series of actions for the sector and for tourism New Zealand, and of course for many of your organisations and for other government agencies and community decision makers. And so look, there will be more impact, unfortunately. But the thought that sprung to mind this morning when preparing for this call is, you know, we have been here before. I think what the last few months can prove is that, if anything, is that we can bounce back, right? That we can, you know, take a knock, we can, you know, rally the horses and the troops and get ourselves realigned and refocused on the opportunities in front of us, and then make those things happen as best we can. And I look at this and think, you know, okay, it's 3 days. That 3 days really gives us a time to evaluate the seriousness or the severity of this particular decision from the Prime Minister and the government, and how that's going to relate to other parts of the country. It gives us a chance to understand how widespread this in fact could be or isn't. Let's hope it isn't. And of course, it will look at things like, well, based upon the severity, how long we're going to be in a different state of flux. I guess it's very important for us to recognise that the quicker that we stamp out any of these cases, irrespective of where they are in New Zealand when they do occur, the quicker we can return to normal operations and get about business. So we're very conscious of that. We're very conscious of the need for these situations to be managed very, very quickly and quite severely to ensure that we have the best chance of stamping this stuff out and getting back to some form of normality. But obviously this means we're being compliant and vigilant and following the advice of the Ministry of Health. And of course, all of us on this call are pretty well versed in all that stuff and how we play our own part. For Tourism New Zealand, we've made the decision last night to temporarily pause all of our paid activity in New Zealand, because obviously our current phase of our campaign targets all New Zealanders and takes a national view. And of course, given the varying alert levels, it wouldn't be appropriate for us to continue to push that program right now. But we are going to look over the next few days and in discussion with ministers and other government agencies to understand how we might move back to some kind of operation. It makes sense. I mean, you might think we've actually, one of the scenarios that we had planned for as Tourism New Zealand was one where, parts of the country might be locked down and other parts of the country might be more open. And so we do have some thoughts and some plans around how we might activate a campaign under those circumstances. But of course, that requires coordination and collaboration, not just with agencies in the central government, but perhaps more importantly with regional tourism organisations and local government. Anyway, I look forward to joining the conversation today and enjoying the Q&A as it comes online, and looking forward to understanding a bit more about how we can work together through the next change, I guess a new change in the circumstance, and that is increasingly common. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Stephen. Over to you, Andrew.
Indeed, to connect with the whānau today, I reach across the Trans-Tasman from Sydney and talk about Australia, close bond obviously between two markets and two countries and two people, and really show where we're at from a planning perspective under the challenging scenarios that we're faced with, as well as hear from you and the questions you might have. Firstly, kia ora from behalf of the Australian market team. Really great team based in Sydney. Work very closely with the Tourism New Zealand team in New Zealand and across RTOs and operators across the country. Specifically wanted to introduce Ashley and Declan, who are joining the marketing team. Ashley started a couple of weeks ago, ex-New Zealand and brand in the Australian team. And Declan, long history with Procter & Gamble, has worked with Visium media agency, Red Bull, and is looking forward to joining the team in a couple of weeks' time. So really great team set for navigating some challenging circumstances that we're faced with. But ultimately, very much operating as we're all in this together. And I say that across Tourism New Zealand, the global whānau that we work amongst, but also with Australia, close connections with Australian tourism, as well as the operators over here, is facing very similar situations with the focus on domestic tourism, and then when borders will open in the future. Wanted to introduce where we're at, and that's around how we will and working to capitalise on a Trans-Tasman travel zone. Working on when it will be the case and when we can realise the full value of it. I think it's worth pointing out that there's an equal comparative value to both economies at just under around 2.6 billion of contribution from visitors to Australia and vice versa into New Zealand, but proportionately to New Zealand's tourism sector, the Australian market is more significant than the New Zealand sector. But it represents so much more than just economic value. There's the connecting of friends and family, there's the reopening of more substantial trade routes, as well as the travel and tourism sector, but also working together is a really strong for brand development of brand New Zealand and brand Australia as progressive, innovative, and really managing the COVID situation for the benefit of their people and the community, but also on the global and how that's seen on the global stage. Both New Zealand and Australia are working through the trips that won't happen during the course of 2020. So 10.1 million trips overseas that aren't to New Zealand that won't happen, are unlikely to happen, and also 1.8 million trips overseas from New Zealand. So how that will then generate itself within the domestic tourism sector, but also in Trans-Tasman in due course. And it's going to be interesting to see how that pays out. Just to give you an example, 1.4 million trips annually to Bali or Indonesia are unlikely to be satisfied this year. So where will they go? Within Australia, but also in New Zealand. I think it's important to point out the perception of the health response of New Zealand in Australia. So this is looking at our active considerers and those most likely to travel to New Zealand in the future. 68% see New Zealand's health response as excellent and 27% is good. So 95% see it as a positive approach. And really interestingly, that health response has a, for 67% of our audience, has a positive, improves their perception of New Zealand as a holiday destination. So not just as a country, but as a holiday destination that they're willing to travel to in the future. And hopefully the rapid response that New Zealand is undertaking at the moment will also seen as moving fast, being first mover to handle a really challenging situation. From brand New Zealand and as a destination amongst our core audience, the appeal for and preference for New Zealand is strong and continues to grow. So we're pretty much tracking at what we have had as record appeal at 67.4 in January 2020, the highest it's ever been, and then preference sitting at 64.6% in June, highest, just under the highest we had in November of 2019. So really positive brand perception of New Zealand and appeal to travel to New Zealand is strong as ever. Interestingly, travel overseas is the most missed activity as a result of COVID in our audience. So most 22 and a missed activity at 57, more so than eating out, more so than socialising with friends in person, and more so than travelling domestically as well. So we know that that's an important part of our audience's lifestyle and who they are, the values that they hold true, and that's something that we're able to bring to life with travel to New Zealand in the future. The activities the speed of their recovery or speed of their travel, we know that 56% of our audience will travel within 6 months or want to travel within 6 months of restrictions being limited. So particularly like a market with Australia, which has a shorter booking cycle from dream to plan to book, that'd be really important to reignite that Trans-Tasman in the future. The level of support for Trans-Tasman Travel Zone remains high from a consumer perspective, slightly dropped between May and June from 72 to 68%, so support the idea, and you see that just underneath that support but have concerns. So, you know, that's something that we'll always be tracking to make sure that our offering from a country is right for their travel and safe to travel in the future. And we know from government, both Jacinda Ardern and Scott Morrison have committed to the idea with the statement that there's a willingness for a Trans-Tasman Travel Zone when it's safe to do so. What's occurred both in Melbourne and more recently in Auckland is the management of that community transmission. So Victoria, as you'll be aware, is now in stage 4 lockdown for, I think they're in their second week of 6 weeks. And that's had a dramatic impact on the viability of reopening the borders in the future. That has created a trigger across the other states in Australia and closing their borders across interstate borders. So it's harder to get a national picture that works for Australia and then how we fit within that. But there's a commitment by both governments to have a national picture and national solution for Trans-Tasman. So that has had an impact on the timing for a Trans-Tasman travel zone. Jacinda Ardern has said it's been put back on the back burner for several months as the COVID situation in Victoria is put under work to be under greater control, and then they'll also have to work through the situation in Auckland and New Zealand in the next couple of weeks as well. I also wanted to point out that before the Victorian outbreak, the states had agreed to largely reopen their economies, including their borders, by late July. That Scott Morrison has conceded that the quick return to restriction-free is now unlikely, and they'll be living under some restrictions into the run into Christmas. So, and potentially a little bit beyond. So that's the new scenario that we're now working with, and that's reflected in both governments' approach. And it's really around that community-free transmission. So our scenario planning that we're working to in Trans-Tasman Travel Zone, the early scenario we were working to when this sort of kicked off in many ways was in July, as referenced in Scott Morrison's comments. We're hoping for a winter in September, and now the most optimal is before Christmas, but the most likely is post-Christmas in what we're calling Scenario Bravo. And that's really requires a lower infection rate over time, management to 0 cases in community transmission, control of and improving of contact tracing in both markets. Huge number of scenarios that they need to work through from a feasibility point of view, logistics, and managing not just the opening of, but then also any outbreaks that may occur. From our approach, we are planning to be ready for that zone at that particular time. We recognise there's an ever-changing market landscape, and we focus on consumer insight and consumer in context to ensure that we're ready to be in market at the most appropriate time. There's no set date for opening borders. Our plan is about being time relevant, not time bound, so that the time that we plan can move depending on the context that we're operating in. There is border friction between states and Australia, and we're working with New Zealand Inc. agencies to ensure we've got a state and national approach to understand the different scenarios that we need to plan for, although we are seeking a national solution across the board. We understand there'll be short notice to execute when announced, and the involvement of Tourism New Zealand and domestic is a good example of that. We need to plan, prepare and be ready to execute. We believe we'll have a longer period than what domestic had for moving in stages, but we still believe we'll have a relatively short time given the significance of it. It will and continue to be an extremely competitive marketplace. The states have significant spend and it's really important from an economic recovery for them to operate in domestic very strongly. So we need to make sure that we are better and bolder to get an unfair share of voice to travel into, not just compete against interstate travel. Challenges around the trade sector and the former size, and we want to capitalise on long-standing partnerships with our long-standing partners that we've had many years operating in Australia and across Trans-Tasman. We want to secure business events, however, it will require a long-term focus, and that's really about maintaining strength and high-value events and our partnerships that we have in place, and really tracking our demand versus with supply, particularly in Trans-Tasman travel capacity, but also working with operators in New Zealand to make sure that we're able to fulfil demand with the right supply network. So it very much is what's the scenario, and how do we react against that? And you'll see that it's really about being agile and upfront with how we go about that. The job to be done for Australia, we've kept it very action-orientated and really clear. And as I said, it's very much time relevant, not time bound. So the first is which we're in now is about priming and being top of mind and keeping the brand alive in the hearts and minds of our target audience. We do this through the stories that we tell, that build brand saliency, that prime our audience and win Australian visitors. And this is brand New Zealand as well as destination New Zealand. So New Zealand's response to COVID is as important as where do I want to go next on holiday. New Zealand election will land in Australia very strongly from a news angle perspective, and all these sorts of things contribute to an understanding of New Zealand and keeping top of mind in a very competitive landscape. The next is about reigniting Trans-Tasman travel at the appropriate time. We need to do this off a strong travel sector and partnerships that reignite the demand to travel against the domestic set, and ensuring that we're getting our unfair share of voice and earned as well as in our other channels to talk the good story of New Zealand. And then the last, but beyond that, is about scaling up with pace and agility. And this is around the turning on of sustainable visitor numbers and value as it's able. And this is actually the most important for us in the long term, because this is about scaling up and ensuring that there's a sustainable demand curve that stands strong in the face of competitive pressure from other markets as other borders open in the long term. Where we are now, very much in the prime phase, and this is we hoped it would only be a short phase around sort of July, August. It's now going to extend into the next couple of months. But with the way that we've established our creative platforms and the way that we work and market allows us to be flexible and agile to bring through the right messaging and reflect that consumer in context. The creative platforms that we use on this we've actually threefold now. TNZ, which was developed locally from the Australian team, I'll come on to it in a moment. And this is about operating in a travel-free environment at the moment, being top of mind and a really innovative way of bringing through what it's like to experience and feel the embrace of our place, and feel it, see and understand our people and place without actually being able to travel. The next one is around messages to the world, so messages from New Zealand, and in our case, messages to Australia. And this is a really flexible campaign that allows us to be agile and pick the right question and answer relative to what the market sentiment is at. And that was kicked off in July, and we'll run through for the rest of the year. And then not forgetting that this is how we went to launch earlier this year, which we had to then put on pause, but is ready to go for next year. And that's about the differentiation of the winter holiday, the winter experience based around the ski experience, and then adding those additional experiences on top of that. I'm pleased to see that some of the copy and some of the content has been repurposed and used within the winter campaign in New Zealand as well. So it shows the value of the network working together. So that's an example of where we can scale up and make sure that there's good audience numbers coming into New Zealand in a prime high value sector for New Zealand. I wanted to spend a little bit of time just sharing about 5 minutes or so around TNZ. It is presented by 100% Pure New Zealand. Think of that as a publishing arm or a film like Warner Brothers producing this thing, which we've called TNZ as a game. And it is TNZ. It's about starting your journey. It's important to highlight it's gaming, not a game. So we're using the entertainment platform of gaming, using gaming as a vehicle to tell our story of people and place in a form of a film tutorial or walkthrough of a video game using a very famous YouTube game broadcaster in Loserfruit to tell the story of New Zealand. When you land, you meet interesting characters, they unlock experiences or quests, and by the end of it, you arrive as a visitor and leave as whānau, having been invited in for a dinner and a dance. So a really innovative way of bringing to life the story of New Zealand. So it's gaming, not a game. We haven't produced TNZ as a game. The game in real life is to travel to New Zealand in the future, but we're able to bring to life in a virtual context. I've got 2 trailers to share with you. The first is a 30-second trailer, and then I've got a 15-second trailer. So hopefully this works off YouTube.
Oh, hey there.
Hello. Oh my god. Biggest open world RPG ever.
So that's had over 450,000 views. It's straight from YouTube link there. What you see at the end is the end cards, which then take you into the hero piece. The hero piece is 9 minutes long, and on the right there's a playlist which then can take you through to other 180-degree experiences that we've built working with operators and RTOs in New Zealand. This is the 15-second trailer. It's had over 800,000 views. So again, really interesting way of showing New Zealand as a country. Focuses on the realm of Rotorua, brings to life some welcoming characters, people in place, and then draws out to show the whole of New Zealand. So we're using the gaming construct and to bring to life New Zealand as a game. This is the hero feature with Loserfruit. She's got 2 million subscribers on YouTube, 1.8 million on Twitch, 600,000 on Twitter. So a huge following. She broadcasts 3 times a day to her audience, to anywhere between, 5,000 to 100,000 at any one time. This is our hero feature. It's 9 minutes and 7 seconds long. So it's a mini feature in many sense. It's had just under, as of this morning, just under 700,000 views, 692,000 views. The average view time is about 3.5 minutes. But 20% are getting all the way through to the end and really going into further depth. So really interesting way of bringing to life the story through using gaming as the biggest entertaining platform in the world. Overall, we've had 3 million views across 23 creative assets in just under 2 weeks. So really interesting reach to bring to life New Zealand. And then the endpoint is for them to go to newzealand.com or planz.com. You can experience different quests as well as link into other parts. So it's been able to drive footfall or traffic to our website at a time where people aren't able to plan and book, so to speak, from an Australian perspective. Really interesting from an innovation perspective. Huge number of firsts here. First virtual press conference, first use of TikTok. We teamed up with Julian Dennison, who was on the Today Show. He was the narrator and was on the morning Today Show. First time we've used Twitch. We were on YouTube Gaming homepage with 82 million subscribers. It's the first time tourism's really used the idea of gaming in the walkthrough tutorial to bring to life. So really innovative piece. And the live virtual stream had 2,500 audience on it, so using virtual to create a wider audience there. It was called out as the best tourism campaign in the pandemic by the Today Show. So a really interesting perspective on it, really keeping that brand alive beyond that. Huge number of coverage highlights from Julian Dennison all the way through to marketing and trade press, so really well supported across trade. And that's helped us really smash our earned target. So this is over 1.1 million in earned AOV, 88 million in earned reach, and over 70 pieces of coverage. And what's really important to highlight is it's the gift that keeps on giving. So it's time relevant, not time bound. So it continues to pick up additional coverage. And we've got a whole array of content which we can play out over the course of the next couple of months within that prime phase. We've just got a couple of minutes, but just wanted to highlight the second piece of activity that we've got, which is around messages from New Zealand, which is a continuation and picking up the brand campaign from Global that we shared in the webinar last week and how we're bringing that through. It's really representing that this is a message from New Zealand and brand New Zealand, and ourselves working with New Zealand Inc. across visit about tourism, investment, products and services and consumption, and then also working with NZ Story and New Zealand education. So really how New Zealand shows up in Australia and engages with a broad audience for them to be able to consume the brand New Zealand, but also our products and also travel there in the future. At the heart of messages from New Zealand from an Australian perspective is this idea of this, we're all in this together. So he waka eke noa, and the idea that with the role for New Zealand is to work with our neighbour Australia and operate as one. So we call it sibling rivalry meets solidarity. So there's a brother-sister relationship in New Zealand and Australia's relationship, but at times you've got to stand together and protect your brother and sister and be there for each other, and we're definitely in that phase at the moment. And that's really coming through in the consumer sentiment that we've picked up, and also that we're looking to reflect it. So not one market or country can stand on the shoulders of the other to get a better view. We have to stand together to overcome this. And I think the scenario that we're faced with now at the moment with Victoria and Auckland is a good example of that. We're only as strong as each other when we're in times of challenge, and we will need to work together to overcome it. In saying that, I also say that, you know, the last slide really is that really how we bring that together with our creative platforms is really important. So our calendar overall is built on this idea of prime, reigniting, and then scaling up. As I said, it's time relevant, not time bound, and these are flexible to turn up and dial down depending on what we need. And that's across our marketing activity, our earned activity, our business events, and our trade partners as well. And so, yeah, that was a summary from where I got to from Australia. Just highlighting it's around priming, reigniting when the Trans-Tasman Travel Zone opens in the future, and then scaling up to support and enrich New Zealand and the lives of New Zealanders in due course. Over to you, Paul.
Fabulous. Many thanks, Andrew. Lots of innovation and exciting happening on your side of the ditch. I'm sure we'll get plenty of questions on that. Head to the usual Q&A button, folks. And also for those of you who've joined in the last 20 minutes or so, Stephen England Hall also joining us for questions, not only on Australia, but anything that's happening in the wider COVID world. First question coming up. Thank you, David. Stephen, are you aware of any developments at the border to create instant COVID tests or similar?
Not specifically, David, in New Zealand, although we are aware of that kind of investment and research being carried out around the world so far. My understanding is that there's a couple of examples of that kind of thinking going on, and with very mixed results. I think the best case I've heard so far is a pretty low success rate on positive tests and a very high number of false negatives, which is of course not what we really want. But so I would imagine that kind of work is going to continue to develop, because I think a lot of economies will depend on it. It's a good question.
Thanks, Stephen. One for you, Andrew, from Yenko. What is the profile of the audience you are targeting with Play NZ?
Yeah, great question, and very important one. So our overall brand audience in Australia is about is really broad. So it's about 10 million people. So 25 to 65 active considerers effectively. So that's who we talk to from a brand perspective. Just remembering that there's 25 million people in Australia, so it's a very big audience. What we've done with Play NZ is keep that narrow to a specific target audience for us, which is 25 to 39 millennials. Target there is around travel and gaming, so an interest in gaming. And don't just take this down sort of console game, it's a broad definition of gaming. That means our audience is around 2 million for that. But what we have found is that as it's gone into market, it's got greater scope beyond that. So effectively think of targeting a sort of a core audience, which will then have flow-on effects, a wider brand audience. We also think that millennial will be one of the options for first to fly with a Trans-Tasman travel zone. If they're able to navigate challenging economic circumstances and have good employment, then they'll have high discretionary income relative to the savings that they've made, low dependency from family, and want to travel. And we know prior to pre-COVID, they saw travel as almost a right rather than a luxury. So is likely to be one of the first audiences or first markets to be able to travel in the future.
Thanks, Andrew. Comment here about that busy little calendar slide you put up before. Folks, just to remind you, we'll go back and we're recording this webinar, so you'll get the opportunity to replay this and have a look at that in detail. So all of that information, you'll see that on tourismnewzealand.com by the end of tomorrow. Is there a consideration of a health passport? Asks Julie.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know that health passports was certainly one of the things that were tabled over the course of the original lockdown, alongside a number of other border managed, what they call MIQ solutions, managed isolation and quarantine. So passports is definitely on a discussion point, not just in New Zealand, but globally. I think the challenge will become, look, I mean, I'm not an expert on the space, but we're certainly keeping an eye on it. I think the challenge will be compliance and testing, and how do you make sure that one passport's equal to another, and all those sorts of usual standards-based issues. But I think we've got, as we've seen in Australia, and of course now in the last 24 hours here in Auckland, and we've watched in other parts of the world too, it goes without saying that from an international travel perspective, whether it be tourism or education or business or investment or any other form of international travel, governments and industries around the world are looking for solutions, looking for ways to make this stuff happen, because it's probably goes without saying that we're unlikely to get out of the woods on this one for some time. And so finding ways, smart, intelligent, and sophisticated ways of solving this problem is becoming increasingly important.
Thanks. Andrew Patrick asks, is there a way for operators to get support from Tourism New Zealand with the messages from New Zealand campaign, perhaps by recording their own messages? Would that be useful, suggests?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the sort of user-generated journey for either operators and RTOs. So that we're in very early stages of messages. So we've had 3 questions related to, shout out what's the most important thing, and if you could encourage the world. I think they're in the development of the next phase for that, increasingly working as they've had success with the domestic campaign, the partner toolkit for other operators and so forth to play a part in that. So I think that's probably the focus area for the global brand team to how to bring that one through.
Thanks, Andrew. Stephen, questions here on the support that we've had from government in supporting the tourism industry.
Yeah, it's probably a little tough one for us to answer, right? I guess there's probably never going to be enough support to go around, and I think, there's been some really good things that the government's done, and I think there's been some things that it's been challenging for them to do. Overall, they've had to make decisions at a government level, not just from a tourism perspective, and I think it's a pretty difficult situation for any government or minister to find themselves in. So I think, look, I think if I was probably quoting some of the people on this call in recent times, there's always more that can be done. It's like we'd like to thank you for the stuff that has happened, and look forward to the things that haven't happening maybe in the future. So it's a difficult thing for us to comment on as Tourism New Zealand, obviously, but I think it's a marathon, not a sprint, in terms of this recovery, and we've got a lot of work to do across the sector and across government agencies to continue to support the industry as best we can.
There's a bit of a supplementary to that. Steve asked, do we have any insight into the new $10 million digital capability fund?
Yeah, we have a little bit of insight into that. Thanks, Steve. I guess the main point there is looking at the digital system requirements of tourism operators and the tourism system, and looking at it from a back of house and a front of house perspective. So how do we help the tourism industries from an operator perspective increase either access to or knowledge of how to use digital tools in either their back of house, i.e. accounting and online tools such as resource management and payroll and things like that, which are essential for business management and obviously have a direct impact on productivity. And at the other end, it's about lifting digital capability and competency across the whole ecosystem in the customer end. So targeting, use of tools, CRM management, online booking, inventory coordination, and things like that. Now, of course, not my understanding, looking at the original papers on that, or initial drafts of the thinking on that, is you need to be quite broad set of digital services that organisations can get access to, because everyone will be at a different stage in that journey, and everyone will already have different levels of capability and competency, from customer management right the way through to system and business management. So the thinking, I believe, behind that digital capability piece is how do we lift that bar for the whole sector? Because if we've got a $20 or $30 billion industry and we can lift productivity across that industry by 5 percentage points or something like that, that creates a significant economic gain for operators and for New Zealand. So that's really the intent behind it. We don't have, I know that there's work going on to flush that out at the moment, Steve. So hopefully we'll hear more soon.
And Grant asks a really interesting question. How many tourists or non-resident New Zealanders are stats showing as being in New Zealand currently?
I'm assuming that question's for me.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Unless, Andrew, you've got an answer for that one. Look, I don't have the numbers directly to hand, but that's actually a really good question. I believe there's about 100,000 or just north of 100,000 visitors in the country. Whether they're tourists or holiday makers, or whether they're other kinds of visitors, I couldn't tell you right now. But I think the last data I saw was around sort of 120,000, 130,000 in New Zealand. And they're all, and some of these people are here on 2-year working holiday visas, and some of them are here on 12-month holiday visas, and some of them are here on student visas, and some of them are here on visitor visas. And of course, they're fully entitled to do so. And some of them don't breach their visa requirements there and are able to continue to look after themselves, then they're free and able to stay.
I think I've got a other end of the scale, but it's how many Kiwis are in Australia. Australia's largest, well, the country with the most Kiwis in it that live offshore. So I remember hearing a stat around sort of 70 to 80% of all Kiwis living overseas live in Australia. I think it's important to point out that the government support has been really important for New Zealanders living in Australia. We operate with a quite different visitor or visa status as what Australians do in New Zealand, but the government has been supported, and I think that's been strong lobbying from New Zealand government to ensure that New Zealanders living in Australia are supported through these challenging times as well, which then has also a knock-on effect for New Zealand. So supporting New Zealanders in Australia is important.
Thanks, Andrew. Are we going to focus on the Lord of the Rings TV series to increase interest in New Zealand? Stephen?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's an incredibly exciting opportunity for the film and television industry in New Zealand, and from a tourism marketing point of view, New Zealand being Middle Earth remains a very important driver of future arrivals. Something like 18% of arrivals to New Zealand in the year preceding COVID stated that one of the main drivers for their visitation here was Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. So continuing to leverage and work on that particular platform is incredibly important to New Zealand. So I would imagine as soon as is practicable that more things will be done with that brand.
International Hobbit Day on 22nd of September as well.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, I was actually I had the benefit of doing something new and spending some time at Hobbiton, which I hadn't done for a long time, and it's fantastic. I mean, it's an incredible experience, great product.
Indeed.
And something that many New Zealanders should probably take the advantage of seeing while they can get a booking. So.
And on that note, James asked a question. He acknowledges it's slightly off topic, but we're happy to go off piste, I think, on just about anything at the moment. What's the overall success so far of the pivot to the domestic campaign?
Yeah, it's a good question. We will be doing a webinar update on that campaign in the next couple of weeks as the data starts to come through. But certainly the information we've had so far is very positive. The early signs are something like 50% of New Zealanders have seen or interacted with the campaign since it launched in terms of Do Something New New Zealand. And in fact, we are hearing from industry and a number of operators around the country that people have been inspired to, be on holiday or go visit a particular place as a consequence of Do Something New. In fact, Do Something New has become, if you like, a phrase that has been picked up around the country by people doing something new, which is, I guess, from a marketing point of view, that's exactly what you want to hear as people start playing back to your own messaging. So look, anecdotally, it's going extremely well. Some of the tests that we've run in terms of the measurement tests with things like the operator direct booking work with Facebook and so forth have proved to be very successful so far to date. And look, as soon as we get more data and more hard facts on that, we look forward to sharing them. Of course, there are some of the areas, things we'd like to improve as always, and there's a few things that we would like to accelerate and do more of. And one of those being, of course, is how do we do hyper-targeting further into specific regional activations at a national level, things like that. And what will that look like in the coming months? And of course, given what's happened in the last 24 hours, that becomes, that becomes pretty important.
Indeed. Question here, do we have any insights into what government's hoping to support for inbound tour operators?
Well, and what I do know there is advice has been provided to the Tourism Recovery Ministers Group. I don't have in front of me the dates of their next discussion meeting, but I know that's certainly on the cards.
Hey, Julie Smith made a comment here. Talking of Hobbiton, or apart from Hobbiton, Red Carpet Tours, this is an ad, not quite, is the only authorised tourism company to lead Lord of the Rings tours in New Zealand, which is of course true. We'd love you to reach out to us in your campaign. So good plug, Julie.
Yeah, sure, Julie. I'm sure they will, Julie. I don't know where that's at. I'm not specifically close to that individual piece of work, but I'm sure as that stuff starts to evolve, we'll get clarity on our role in it and the broader industry.
Now, the Tourism Futures Task Force. Anything you're able to share other than what's in the media, Stephen?
I'm not. No, the people that will be in the position to share that work will be the co-chairs. So Steve Chadwick and Grant Webster are the ones that you'll need to connect with on that. Tourism New Zealand, of course, is, along with MB and DOC, are ex officio members of the task force, but it's not our place for us to lead those discussions. It's really up to the task force itself to make comment on that.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that, Stephen. And you'll find a list of all of the people on that on the mb.govt.nz website. Slight lull in questions here. Send them through, folks. We've got 5 or 10 minutes if you want to ask any more questions. I know that stats question, and I think I do recall seeing that too, over 120,000 people here. The Statistics New Zealand website too, if you Google that, did have a report a couple of weeks ago that went into quite a bit of detail about how many people there were from what countries and even where they were in New Zealand as well. So Google's your friend there, and you'll be able to find all of that information.
Yeah, I mean, I do know. Am I on mute? No, I was going to say.
You're all good.
I do know, Paul, that some of you might know this, but the May arrivals numbers for people coming into the country was the lowest it's been in 61 years. For those people that can remember, back to those dates. But it's so we haven't had too many. But there were some arrivals. There were 900 arrivals, I think, in May, which is quite surprising, really, when you think about it.
Absolutely. Oh, more. We're on the Hobbit theme here. Any updates on the Peter Jackson Movie Museum for Wellington? I don't know if we know any more than anybody else does.
No, I certainly don't have any insight into that one there. But I don't know if David Perks is on the line today or not, Paul. But if he is, he might have a view on that.
Yeah, if anybody there's listening from Wellington, you know anything more, just type it in the Q&A panel. I'll be happy to pass that one on.
And a question here, Paul, are you still the best quiz master in New Zealand?
We need a poll and everyone could vote.
I think we'll be back to, I have had a message, it could be back to Friday virtual drinks by Zoom this Friday as we all start working from home again.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting though. I mean, I'd be interested. I mean, obviously I don't know how this thing works at the moment, but it would, you know, I think what we have seen in the last couple of months from certainly domestically is the willingness for Kiwis to get out there and do stuff, engage and involve and participate in the tourism sector at a larger number than have done before. Yeah, something like 130,000 more New Zealanders in New Zealand over the last school holidays than there were in previous year, as an example, and a big chunk of those people have got out and about. And one of the things we're very aware of at TNZ and has been in discussions with numbers of RTOs and operators is how do we, with a fairly constrained audience, being Kiwis only, how do we change the demand curve enough to have an effect across the midweek and into holiday periods? Because obviously if we can do that, then the industry would be benefiting significantly. And that is something that Bjorn and the team are working on right now is, you know, what are the 2 or 3 key levers that we can pull to try and change the shape of that behaviour, because it's critical to everybody. So look, there's you know, it's been, as I mentioned before to James's question, things are improving. It's going pretty well, but we want to get down to another level of intervention and activation and try and change some behaviours at scale, which is pretty exciting. And building on the back of Andrew's presentation about Australia, look, the big missing question is when. But what I can assure you is the work as to what are we going to do and how we're going to activate it and what we're going to think about in terms of kindling the opportunity in Australia is happening and continuously being refreshed, as you would have heard from Andrew's presentation. The bit of course that's missing and unknown is we just don't know when the dates are going to occur, and we have to continue to refresh and remodel our expectations based upon the changes in the border or in the transmission rates in different countries. And that's just something that we're just unfortunately having to contend with pretty much on a weekly basis at the moment.
Indeed. Well, we may be able to save some bandwidth and wrap this up a little early. Any last words from you across the Tasman, Andrew?
Oh, I think, look, I just wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to talk. I think, you know, looking back to what Paul said earlier, to start with was when this was planned, we were in a different situation, and 6 weeks' time we might be in another different one as well. So, but I think the commitment to the task is as strong as ever, and we're energised by the opportunity to continue to reforecast and bring new ideas through based on a really quite a unique set of circumstances we're all faced with. And I think the New Zealand working with Australia and vice versa is really important. That sibling rivalry to solidarity stands for not just from an organisational perspective, but ultimately as two countries working together in the global market. We're both long-term, we're both long-haul markets, which is going to be challenging to compete with other markets in the future. So the more we get working together, the better. We've got the FIFA 2023 Women's World Cup, which is a hashtag as one. So, you know, we're already doing the same. And, you know, in closing out, introduction to my team, please just get in touch if there's anything, anything you want to know from a market perspective. We're working closely with the learnings from domestic and development of product for the domestic market that will then play a role for bringing Australian tourists in the future. We hope that's sooner rather than later. At the moment, there's a little bit to navigate through. So yeah, final sign off is just thank you for your time.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. And I see Jean from our team here has posted Wellington Convention and Exhibition Centre will be named Takina when it opens in 2023. And of course, pointing out no longer any plans for a movie museum in there. And of course, Wendy's also noting business events are a great way to build midweek occupancy, particularly as events are booked well in advance. So thanks, Andrew, for your sign off. Stephen, any last words there?
No, just thank you again, everyone, for joining the call today. Look, we will continue to run webinars and update as much as we can as on the information we have available to us. If you have got questions, of course, just continue to send them through to us. If we can find a path to answer them, we definitely will. And to your point about the events and business events in particular, I couldn't agree more. Events are absolutely on our radar. As some of you will be aware, there's been a significant allocation of resource from central government towards events, and I look forward to seeing how that unfolds and plays out. But I think people, certainly regional tourism organisations and EDAs, should look to that as being not just tourism events in terms of holiday type activity, but also cultural events, business events, and other kinds of events that can stimulate different kinds of movement of people around the country when it's safe to do so. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and look, we'll just stay well and look after yourselves and look forward to connecting as soon as possible.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Andrew. Just a reminder, everybody, there will be a copy of this recording placed on tourismnewzealand.com. Should be there by tomorrow, and also visit there for a list of all of our upcoming webinars. And if you ever need any questions answered, just send an email to feedback@tnz.govt.nz. So on behalf of our team, thank you, everybody, for joining us. We've really appreciated you giving up your time on what's ending up to be quite a busy and crazy day. So take care, everybody. We'll see you all again very soon indeed. Ngā mihi.
And thank you, Paul.